Welcome to our first video. In this video, I'm going to give a short mini lesson on how a conclusion is reached in the psychology experiment. And when I give this lesson in class, I usually give it on the first day of class, and I usually call it a mini lecture because it's not really a complete lecture, it's more just a warm-up lesson for our class. In this mini lecture, I introduce some concepts that we'll be building on throughout the semester. The purpose of this mini lecture is just to introduce you to some ideas early on, just so that you have more time to process them and more time to think them over, basically. A lot of the concepts we'll be covering today tend to be challenging, so I just want to expose you to them as soon as possible. So like I said, today's mini lesson will be about how a conclusion is reached in a psychology experiment. Let's start by talking about the meaning of the word experiment. So I think we all have an intuitive idea of what the word experiment means, because the word experiment is commonly used in everyday life. For example, a person might be cooking, and the person might decide to add a new ingredient to a recipe just to see what it tastes like. And that person might say that I was experimenting with the recipe. So in everyday life, people often use the word experiment as just another word for doing something and then observing what happens. But in psychology, the word experiment has a more specific meaning that I'll go over right now. In psychology, an experiment is a study with random assignment to manipulated conditions. So in psychology, a study has to have two things to be considered an experiment. It has to have random assignment, and it has to have manipulated conditions. So I'll break this definition down by going over the meaning of random assignment and the meaning of manipulated conditions. So let's start with the meaning of the phrase manipulated conditions. Actually, let's just start by going over the meaning of the word conditions. In a psychology experiment, conditions are just situations that are experienced by the participants. So let's say I'm doing an experiment to test the effect of temperature on memory, and I have one group taking a memory test in a 60-degree room, and I have another group taking the same memory test in an 80-degree room. In that experiment, my two conditions would be 60 degrees and 80 degrees. Those are the two situations that my participants are experiencing. So when you hear the word conditions, just think situations. And now let's talk about the word manipulation. In a psychology experiment, manipulation is something that's done by the researcher. Manipulation is the act of setting up the conditions that the participants will experience. So if I'm doing that temperature experiment, the act of me setting one room to 60 degrees and one room to 80 degrees would be manipulation. When I do that, I'm manipulating the temperature of the room. So basically, manipulated conditions are just conditions that are set up or staged by the researcher. They're conditions that didn't occur naturally. So if I was doing a study in which I give a recall test on a cold day and a recall test on a hot day, I wouldn't be manipulating temperature in that study because I'm just making use of temperatures that have just happened naturally. So yeah, that's what manipulated conditions are. So now let's talk about random assignment. So I think the meaning of random assignment is pretty straightforward or self-explanatory. In an experiment, random assignment is just the process of randomly sorting participants into separate groups that go into different conditions. So if I was doing that temperature experiment, I would randomly assign my participants to two separate groups, and I would put one group in the cold room and one group in the hot room. And there's different ways to do random assignment in an experiment. One way is just by doing a series of coin tosses. As a researcher, you could do a series of coin tosses, and heads would send a person to one group, and tails would send a person to another group. Another way of doing random assignment is with something called a random number generator. A random number generator is just a program that spits out a bunch of random numbers. So if you wanted to randomly assign people to two groups, you could ask a random number generator to spit out a sequence of ones and twos, and you would use that sequence to assign your participants to the groups. And you might end up getting a sequence like 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1, or something like that. And if all of your participants are in one location, like a classroom, and they're all being tested at the same time, one way to randomly assign them is just by taking a stack of cards, shuffling it, and passing out the cards to your participants. So if all of your participants were in a classroom, and you were doing an experiment, you could just take a stack of papers, write the number 1 on half of them, write the number 2 on half of them, shuffle the cards, and pass them out, and that would randomly assign your participants to two groups, because each person who gets a 1 goes to group 1, and each person who gets a 2 goes to group 2. That's a pretty quick and easy way to randomly assign people. Actually, whenever I do an experiment in class as an in-class activity, that's the way I randomly assign my students to two separate groups, because it's pretty quick and easy to do. So now I think we understand the meaning of the word experiment. Let's now talk about the purpose of an experiment in psychology.